It was a map showing every detail of Hogwarts castle grounds. But the truly remarkable thing was that there were tiny ink dots moving around, and each labeled with the name of minuscule writing. Astounded, Harry bent over bent over it, and labeled dot on the top of the left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing in his study. The caretaker's cat, Miss North, was prowling on the second floor. Peeves, the poltergeist, was currently bouncing around in the trophy room, and Harry's eyes traveled up and down the familiar corridors. He noticed something else. The map showed a set of passages that he'd never entered, and many of them seemed to lead right into Hogsmeade, said Fred, tracing one of them with his finger. There are 7 in all now. Filch knows about these 4. He pointed them out. But we're sure we're the only ones who know about these. Don't bother with the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor. We used it until last winter, but it's caved in, completely blocked. And we don't reckon anyone's ever used this one because the Whomping Willows plant is right over the entrance. But this one leads right into the cellar of Honeydukes. We've used it loads of times. And you might have noticed the entrance is right outside this room, through that one-eyed old crone's hump. Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, sighed George, patting the head of the map. We owe them so much. Noble men, working tirelessly to help the new generation of lawbreakers, said Fred solemnly. Right, said George briskly. Don't forget to wipe it after you've used it. Or anyone can read it, Fred said warningly. Just tap it again and say, mischief manage, and it will go blank. So young, Harry, said Fred, in an uncanny impersonation of Percy. Mind you behave yourself. See you in Honeydew, said George, winking. They left the room, both smirking in satisfied sort of way. Harry stood there, gazing at the miraculous map. He watched the tiny ink as Miss Norris turned left, paused to sniff at something on the floor. If Filch really didn't know, he wouldn't have to pass the Dementors at all. But even as he stood there, flooded with excitement, something Harry had heard Mr. Weasley say, something floating back into his memory. Never trust anything that can think for itself, if you can't see where it keeps its brain. The map was one of those dangerous magical objects Mr. Weasley had been warning against. Aids for magical mischief makers. But then, Harry reasoned, he only wanted to use it to go to Hogsmeade. It wasn't as though he wanted to steal anything or attack anyone, and Fred and George had been using it for years without anything horrible happening. Harry traced the secret passage to Honeydukes with his finger, and then quite suddenly, he thought, as though following orders, he rolled up the map, stuffed it inside his robes, and hurried to the door of the classroom. He opened a couple of inches, and there was no one inside. Very carefully, he edged out of the room behind one of the statue-eyed witch. What did he have to do? He pulled out the map again, and to his astonishment, that a new ink figure appeared upon it, labeled Harry Potter. This figure was standing exactly where the real Harry Potter was standing. About halfway down the 3rd floor corridor, Harry watched carefully as the little ink itself appeared to be tapping the witch with a minute hand. Harry quickly took out his real wand and tapped the statue. Nothing happened. He looked back at the map, and the tiniest speech bubble had appeared next to his figure with the word Descendium. Descendium, Harry whispered, tapping the stone of the witch again. At once, the statue's hump opened wide enough for a fairly thin person. Harry glanced quickly up and down the corridor, then tucked the map away again, hoisted himself into the hole head first, and pushed himself forward. He slid out of the considerable doorway, away down, that felt like a stone slide, then landed on a cold, damp earth. He stood up, looking around. It was pitch dark. He held up his wand, muttered, "Luminous," and he saw what was a very narrow, low earth passageway. He raised his map, tapped it with the tip of his wand, and muttered, "Mischief manage." The map went blank at once. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside his robes, then his heart beating fast. Both excited and apprehensive, he set off. The passage twisted and turned more like the burrow of a giant rabbit than anything else. Harry hurried along it, stumbling now and then the uneven floor, holding his wand out in front of him. It took ages, but Harry had thought of honeydukes to sustain him. After what felt like an hour, the passage began to rise. Panting, Harry sped up, his face hot, his feet very cold. 10 minutes later, he came up to the foot of some worn stone steps, which rose out right above him. Careful not to make any noise, Harry began to climb. 100 steps, 200 steps. He lost count as he climbed, watching his feet. Then, without warning, he hit his head on something hard. It seemed to be a trap door. Harry stood there, massaging the top of his head, listening. He couldn't hear any sounds above him. Very slowly he pushed the trapdoor open and peered over the edge. Harry climbed out of the trapdoor and replaced it, blended in so perfectly with the dusty floor that it was impossible to tell where it was. Harry crept slowly towards the wooden staircase that led upstairs. Now he could definitely hear voices, not to mention the tinkle of a bell and the opening of and shutting of a door. Wondering what he ought to do, he suddenly heard the door open much closer at hand. Somebody was about to come downstairs and get another box of jelly slugs, dear. They're nearly cleaned out of us out, the woman's voice said. A pair of feet came coming down the staircase. Harry leapt behind an enormous crate and waited for the footsteps to pass. He heard the man shifting boxes in the opposite wall. He might not get another chance, so quickly and silently Harry dodged out of the hiding place and climbed up the staircase. Looking back, he saw an enormous black side and shiny bald head buried in a box. Harry reached the door at the top of the stairs, slid through it, and found himself behind the counter of honeydukes. He ducked, crept sideways, and then straightened up. Honeydukes was so crowded with Hogwarts students that no one looked twice at Harry. He edged among them, looking around, suppressed a laugh when he imagined the look that would spread over Dudley Piggy's face if he could see where Harry was now. There were shelves upon shelves of the most succulent-looking sweets imaginable, creamy chunks of nougat, shimmering pink squares of coconut ice, fat honey-colored toffees, hundreds of different kinds of chocolates in neat rows. There was a large barrel of every flavored bulk beans, and another of fizzing whizbees. The levitating sherbet bowls that Ron mentioned along yet another wall were special effects sweets. Drubel's best blowing gum, which filled a room with a bluebell-colored bubbles that refused to pop for days. The strange, splintery, tooth-flossing stringaments, the tiny black pepper imps, breathe fire for your friends, ice mice, hear your teeth clatter squeak, peppermint cream shaped like toads, hop realistically in the stomach, fragile sugar-spun quills, exploding bonbons. Harry squeezed himself through the crowd in 6 years and saw a sign hanging in the farthest corner of the shop. Unusual tastes. Ron and Hermione were standing underneath it, examining a tray of blood-flavored lollipops. Harry sneaked up behind them. No, Harry won't want one of these. They're for vampires, I expect, Hermione was saying. How about these? Said Ron, shoving a jar of Crookshanks under Hermione's nose. Definitely not, said Harry. Ron nearly dropped the jar. Harry, squealed Hermione, what are you doing here? How did you... Wow, said Ron, looking very impressed. You've learned to apparate. Of course I haven't, said Harry. He dropped his voice so low that none of them, the 6 years, could hear him, and they told him all about the Marauders map. How come Fred and George never gave it to me? Said Ron, outraged. I'm their brother. But Harry isn't going to keep it, said Hermione, as though an idea was ludicrous. He's going to hand it to Professor McGonagall, aren't you, Harry? No, I'm not, said Harry. Are you mad? Said Ron, goggling at Hermione. Hand something over that good. If I hand it in, I'll have to say where I got it. Filch will know where Fred and George have nicked it. But what about Sirius Black? Hermione hissed. He could be using one of these passages on the map to get into the castle. Teachers have got to know. He can't be getting in through the passages, said Harry quickly. There are 7 secret tunnels on the map, right? Fred and George reckon Filch already knows about 4 of them. And then the other 3, well, one of them's caved in, so no one can get through that. One of them's the Whomping Willow planted over the entrance. You can't get out of that. And I just came through, well, it's really hard to see on the entrance to it down to the cellar, unless you know where it's there. Harry hesitated. What if Black did know where the passages were? Ron, however, cleared his throat significantly and pointed to the notice pasted on the sweet shop door. By order of Ministry of Magic, customers are reminded that until further notice, Dementors will be patrolling the streets of Hogsmeade every night after sundown. This measure has been in place for the safety of Hogsmeade's residents and will be lifted upon the capture of Sirius Black, and therefore advisable that you complete your shopping well before nightfall. Merry Christmas. See, said Ron quietly. I'd like to see Black try and break into Honeydukes with the Dementors swarming all over the village. Anyway, Hermione, the Honeydukes owner would hear a break-in, wouldn't they? They live close. They live over the shop. Yes, but Hermione seemed to be struggling to find another problem. Look, Harry still shouldn't be coming into Hogsmeade. He hasn't got a signed form. If anyone finds out, he'll be in so much trouble. And it's not nightfall yet. What if Sirius Black turns up today? Now? We'd have a job spotting Harry, said Ron, nodding through the millowed windows at thick swelling snow. Come on, Hermione, it's Christmas. Harry deserves a break. Hermione bit her lip, looking extremely worried. Are you going to report me? Asked her, grinning. Oh, of course not. But honestly, Harry. Seen the fizzing whizbees, Harry? Said Ron, grabbing him and leading him over to the barrel. And these jelly slugs. And they're acid pops. Fred gave me one of those when I was 7. It burnt a hole right through my tongue. I remember Mom walloping him with her broomstick. Ron stared broodingly into the acid pop box. Reckon Fred'd take a bit of cockroach cluster if I told him they were peanuts. When Ron and Hermione had paid for all their sweets, the 3 of them left Honeydukes for the blizzard outside. Hogsmeade looked like a Christmas card, a little thatched cottage, and shops were all covered in a layer of crisp snow. There were holly wreaths in the doors and sprigs of enchanted candles hanging from the trees. Harry shivered, unlike the other 2. He didn't have his cloak. They headed up to the street, heads bowed against the wind. Ron and Hermione shouting through their scarves. That's the post office. Zonkel's up there. We could go up to the Shrieking Shack. Tell you what, Ron said with his teeth chattering. We'll go for a butterbeer and the 3 broomsticks. Harry was more than willing. The wind was fierce and his hands were freezing, so they crossed the road, and in a few minutes they were entering the tiny inn. It was extremely crowded and noisy and warm and smoky and curvy, and sort of woman with a pretty face was serving a bunch of rowdy warlocks up at the bar. There's Madame Rose Myrta, said Ron. I'll get the drinks. Shall I? He added, going slightly red. Harry and Hermione made their way back into the back of the room, where there was a small vacant table between the window and the handsome Christmas tree which stood next to the fireplace. Ron came back 5 minutes later, carrying 3 foaming tankards of hot butterbeer. "Merry Christmas," he said happily, raising his tankard. Harry drank deeply. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted, and seemed to heat every bit of him from inside. A sudden breeze ruffled his hair. The door of 3 broomsticks had opened again. Harry looked over to see the tankard and choked. Professor McGonagall and Flitwick had just entered the pub with a flurry of snowflakes, shortly followed by Hagrid, who was deep in conversation with a poorly man, a lime green bowler hat, and a pinstripe cloak. Cornelius Fudge, Minister of Magic. In an instant, Ron and Hermione had both placed their hands on the top of Harry's head and forced him down off his wood stool under the table. Dripping with butterbeer and crouching out of sight, Harry clutched his empty tankard and watched the teachers and Fudge's feet move towards their bar, then turn and walk right towards him. Somewhere above him, Hermione whispered, "Malbiflores." The Christmas tree beside the table rose a few inches off the ground and drifted sideways and landed with a soft thump right to the side of their table, hiding them from view. Staring through the dense lower branches, Harry saw 4 sets of chairs' legs move back from the table right beside them, and he heard the grunts and sighs of the teachers and the minister as they sat down. Next he saw another pair of feet wearing sparkly turquoise high heels, and he heard a woman's voice. "Small gilly water, mine," said Professor McGonagall's voice. "4 pints of mulled mead." "Ta, Rosematha," said Hagrid. "A cherry syrup soda with ice and umbrella." Said Professor Flitwick, smacking his lip. "So you'll be the red currant rum, Minister?" "Thank you, Rosematha, my dear," said Fudge's voice. "Lovely to see you again, I must say. Have one yourself, won't you? Come and join us." "Well, thank you very much, Minister." Harry watched the glittering heels march away back again. His heart was pounding uncomfortably in his throat. Why hadn't it occurred to him that he was just last week from term, the teachers too, and how they were long were they going to sit there? Oh, he needed some time to sneak back to Honeydukes if he wanted to return to school tonight. Hermione's leg gave a nervous twitch next to him. "So what brings you to this neck of the woods, Minister?" came Madame Rosetta's voice. Harry saw the lower pair of Fudge's thick body twist in his chair as though he were checking for eavesdroppers, and then he said in a super quiet voice, "What else, my dear, but Sirius Black? I dare say you heard what happened at the school on Halloween." "I did hear a rumor," admitted Madame Rosemata. "Did he tell you the whole pub? Did you tell the whole pub, Hagrid?" said Professor McGonagall exasperately. "Do you think Black's still in the area, Minister?" whispered Madame Rosemerta.